Hi everyone, I'm Gordon Burkell from Filmmaker U at filmmakeru.com. We create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify their existing skill set. Now, every week we like to do a live at 2 p.m. with a film professional to chat and give you a chance to join in and ask questions. And this week we have Monica Daniel, the editor of Altered Carbon, DC Legends of Tomorrow, and Colony. Hi Monica, welcome to Filmmaker U.
Hello.
All right, before we get into this, because we're going to wait for some of these questions to come up, why don't you tell me about editing DC Legends of Tomorrow? What were some of the challenges that you've faced?
Well, if the thing with Legends, it's not just a one genre show. We've had episodes that had like a Bollywood style dance segment. We've had kind of more horror themed episodes. There's drama, there's comedy, there's action, there's superhero stuff. So you kind of get like a taste of every single genre in this one show. And, every time we would get a new script, we're like, well, they can't get any crazier than this. Like, how are we going to top this? And then we'd get the script for the next episode. We're like, well, they topped it. Okay. So that's the thing with Legends is you never know what you're going to get. There's no like standard operating procedure really as far as like how to approach any particular episode. So for example, the first episode that I edited on this season was I shared the editing credit with the editor I'd been working with, Tom Runquist, and it was episode 5, and it was called Mortal Combat, because our main villain for the episode was Genghis Khan.
Yeah.
And he tries to take over the triads in the world using scooters, electric scooters. So that'll give you kind of an idea of how random our show gets sometimes. But, it was really tricky. And this is how, if you work on Legends, they're like, yeah, we're gonna let you edit. You're thrown in the deep end, and there's no easing into it, because we decided when we were working on it, we were going to split I edited half, and then Tom edited the other half. And we're like, okay, we'll do it by acts. He took all the odd acts, I'll took the even acts. And it turns out the biggest, most complex action scene was in Act 2, which was my act. And it was just this insane John Woo style. It was very, the whole concept was like, it was homage to John Woo. So this John Woo style shootout with like a bunch of extras, a bunch of triads, people shooting at each other, people flipping off of tables, people sliding across the floor. Meanwhile, we're supposed to be following our characters as they're trying to track down Genghis Khan through all this madness as all this fight is happening. And, there's a lot of slow-mo because that's the John Woo style. And there were different locations as they moved to different rooms. And, that was the first episode I received credit up for Legends. It's like, all right, here you go.
Well, it's gonna be
scene now. Make it pretty.
It's gonna be great for your reel though, because like if you're like, I
my God,
want to edit a Bollywood film, it's like here's the scene that I cut for Legends, or I want to do.
Yeah, it's so random because the season before, I was working with the editor, and I was like, hey, can I cut this one scene just to cut it? And it was this scene that was about the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And it was the director, the creator of Godzilla, or Gojira, was our main character. So we're going back to how he got the idea for Godzilla. Like I said, show's random. And the whole scene is about him describing this like horrible experience of what it was like walking through people's ashes and realizing he's telling this to our main characters, and this is really amazing, intense, emotional scene. And so it's like I have that scene that just like they pretty much had no notes on it, because there was like, oh my God, that was amazing. I got like tears in my eyes. And then I got a tea house John Woo fight scene in another episode, and later it's like their big reveal of Khan emerging from the shadows and smoke on a scooter, which is ridiculous in itself. But, I had to do it in a way that made it seem super cool. So it's such an interesting, they're always different. Every episode, it's just like a new challenge, which I really like. I enjoy being challenged. So it's kind of the perfect show because it's like, oh, let me try this. Let me try this. And, it's all stuff I like watching. I like watching action. I like drama. I like throwing a little bit of comedy in there. One of my shows that I wish that went on further, which I don't know if people have really heard of it. It's called Special Unit 2.
I haven't heard of it.
It went on for 2 seasons. I think it was like UPN. It's old, but it was kind of the same vein where it was like all these magical creatures and there was a police force trying to like keep them in check, and it was like more silly than dramatic, but it just had this nice sense of whimsy to it. And it was canceled, and the only way you can watch it now is people post it on YouTube. You can't even buy it anywhere. Wow. I've tried. I was like, I will give you my money if you let me watch these episodes, and you can't buy it anywhere.
So frustrating, because I've had shows like that where it's like, we don't sell it, but it's not available.
I was like, just put it on iTunes. How hard is that?
Put it up. I'll hand you my money.
Yes.
And this transaction can be complete.
Yeah. And then, Legends, it's weird. This last season I was put in, and I think it helped that, I've had all this years of experience editing. It's just like the scripted editing credits. It's like a different career path. So it's like building that up again. So the first situation, the episode is I was co-editing, and they're like, it was them basically giving me a chance. They're like, can you do this? And I knew I could do it. And so we split it in half. And the editor I was working with, he's like, how much do you want to cut? It's up to you. I'll leave it up to you. I was like, let's do half and half. And he was like, fine, we're doing it. And then the second episode, I actually took over for an episode at producer's cut. So I was taking over a show that I was not familiar with dailies, and I had to just work with producers. And that happened is because that editor took it to a point, and then he had to go up to prep to direct an episode.
Oh, wow.
So it was actually like a good situation. It wasn't like an awkward thing where like, oh, someone got fired, we need someone to fill the spot. No, it's like, no, he's moving up to direct, which is what he really wanted to do. And so I was able to take over his episode of Producer's Cut. So now I was thrown in a completely different situation, or a different kind of episode that was less action. There were some action things in it, but it was mostly like visual effects type of action. So I needed to rework some visual effects scenes to make it make sense, because all this magic was happening. And there was more like sexual tension that I had to build between one of our characters, Zari, and then John Constantine. And so it was about, I was focusing on very specific things, because at that point I was already in Producer's Cut. So it was really just about finessing and fine tuning. But, I had to do that coming from like, okay, well, like how much do I actually need to change? Because, I wanted to respect the work my editor did. It's like, well, what do they want? I'm going to change what the producers asked me to change, while still respecting the other editor's work on it. I don't believe in doing work just to change someone's work, because I think that's just kind of, I wouldn't like if someone did that to me. Well, I just changed it to make it different because now it's mine. It's like, no, I don't want to do that. So, I just, addressed their notes, any changes they wanted to make, and the episode turned out really well. And then the episode that I solo edited was a zombie apocalypse horror episode where our heroes are immortal except for Zari, and they're trying to get back to their ship, the Wave Rider, and they have to take the bus and public transportation. They have like no way of getting to their ship in England. Meanwhile, our villains, one of the Fates are our villains this season, creates a zombie apocalypse in England to send the zombies after them.
Just a small, yeah.
So it's like, it's kind of different. We got Genghis Khan on scooters, Bollywood, zombie apocalypse horde. And that was the episode that the editor went to direct. So I was actually editing the episode that the other editor was directing.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
I have a question here from Nikyle, who wants to know, how many times do you rewatch the entire footage? And at what stages of the editing process do you rewatch that footage? And then a sort of follow-up question is, how often do you use snippets from shots that were never intended to be part of the final film? So like I'm
I
assuming
mean,
beyond the slates.
yeah, that's all just depends on the situation. I mean, it happens all the time. It's not my initial go-to. So what my process, what I do is before I even watch all the footage, this is my general process is I will, if it's especially like a dialogue driven scene, I'll just take the last take of like the medium coverage or something, and I'll just grab it and I'll just quickly build a string out like in a couple minutes. And it'll be crap. I literally call it my craptacular assembly or something like that, or assembly of crap. And I'll just watch that just to get a sense of the scene. Because when you're reading it versus what they shoot, which, you know, sometimes they change from what's written, you know, it's very different. So, you know, I read the scene to get a sense of like, okay, this is kind of the subtext, this is what I need to be communicating. Then I'll watch that string out and just to get an idea of what the scene is. And it's like the worst string, it's the worst edited scene version of that scene you will see. I don't show it to anyone. And then once I see that and I have an idea of like, okay, I need to build a moment kind of right here, I need to build a moment right there. And so I have a better idea of what I could be looking for when I watch the dailies. And there's another big important reason I do this is I have that same fear that a lot of people have. It's like, oh God, I'm staring at an empty timeline. Where do I start? I totally have that with every scene. Like, oh God, how am I going to put this together? Oh my God, you know, it's just a little bit of that imposter syndrome. And so if I already put something that I know is going to be crap, something's on the timeline. It's like, okay, I have a place to start and I can change whatever I want. It also gives me a sense of like, is this a 3-minute scene, a 4-minute scene? Because then I also have a better idea of, okay, this is going to take me a while to cut versus like a 30-second scene.
Now we do, sorry to interrupt, but we do have some people who are just starting their careers watching, and someone wants to know if you could explain what an assembly cut is and string outs.
It's just the very first version of my cut. If you think of it, think of like a sculpture when you're just kind of, it's like a sketch. If you're drawing, it's a sketch of an idea. So it's very rough. The cuts are really choppy. So it was just a place for me to start to sort of get my thoughts focused because my brain tends to go in like 5 million directions. So it like helps me focus. I know people who actually edit differently where they will literally start with it and they will refine every section as they're going before they move on to the next part. And I can't work like that because it's like, well, I don't know where I'm going. And if what I see later might change how I want to cut this first part. So I like seeing the whole picture first before I start getting into the minute details.
Now,
so that's basically what a string out is.
Lisa's posted a really interesting question, which I don't think I've ever heard someone ask. And so what's a unique aspect about being an assistant that you enjoy that you don't get to do as an editor?
I mean, the editor can kind of do what they want. It's really what they don't have time to do. I mean, I can't say I take great joy in turnovers. So
not many people do.
Yeah. You know what I like about being an assistant is, and this is just, I came up as an online and offline editor. So when I was done cutting, they would often hire me to color correct, master, and deliver to the networks. And that's kind of more technically oriented, more workflow oriented. I like the idea of like workflows and trying to figure out like steps in a path. And that falls more on the assistant, is the workflow and like figuring things out and how to organize things. That usually falls on the assistant. And so I like that aspect of it. As the assistant, the assistants usually are the ones who are creating temp visual effects. I've worked with editors who like doing their own temp visual effects because they need it to help like build crazy scenes sometimes. For the most part, that as an assistant editor, that usually falls on me because the editor needs to like, they'll leave a slate like, monster flies across the sky or whatever, and it's like, okay, well, I could try to attempt that with like a concept sketch or
Yeah.
something we have. So I really enjoy those. I think as an editor, I still did my own temps.
Mhm.
Because that's just, I really love doing them. So, you know, it really kind of depends on the editor. A lot of editors will leave that to either the visual effects editor or their assistant editors, if there's not a visual effects editor, to help with those temps. I mean, I don't mess putting in like 50 muzzle flashes, but like
Yeah.
they're interesting visual effects builds I really like doing. And
Now,
the workflow. I do like workflow. I use both sides of my brain. So
now Reed is asking this question, and this is interesting because you and I were chatting about Mandalorian just before we went
yes.
live. Reed wants to know, do you know if the Unreal Engine technology being used to prototype VFX is going to be in scripted shows anytime soon?
Well, that's more of a question for like visual effects vendors, like the
Yeah.
vendor companies. Because when we on the shows I've worked on, we will do an editorial, because that's the department I'm in. You know, we'll
Mhm.
do our temps in Avid, and we'll just won't worry about it. Any 3D modeling type of stuff, I think in features, you know, they might do more of that, but in TVR, you know, we have so little time. It's like, oh, 3D model, let the visual effects company or the visual effects editor figure that out. And we have a visual effects editor on Legends, and he you know, will do stuff in After Effects for any kind of 3D modeling. Sometimes he'll create something called a turntable that the visual effects vendor will give us. So we have, because one time we had like a baby dragon in an
Yeah.
episode. And so they gave us their turntable, basically the rough of what the dragon's was going to look like, so I could actually make it move. So what the turntable is
Yeah, I was just
exactly
about to
what it
ask you.
sounds like. It's the model, and then since we just have a flat 2D file, it just spins
Okay.
one rotation, and then we'll just, you know, freeze frame the angle we want, and then I'll move it around with like 3D picture in picture and resize it and make it dance around. And then if I want it to turn, then I'll have to just like use another freeze frame of a different angle to make it move. And so that's something we do. As far as Unreal Engine stuff, that's deep visual effects.
Yeah.
That's not something I deal with. I'm sure the visual effects vendors would be able to answer that question, or
Yeah.
visual effects producers would be able to answer that question. But
Well,
it's not something because I have so much other stuff to do.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with other crazy software.
What would you say is the most challenging scene you've tackled in your career as an editor?
It was even more crazy than the tea house shootout with a bunch of triads and people flying off tables and bullets flying everywhere. So on the last episode I cut, which is called I Am Legends, which I approve of the title, so play on I Am Legend, even though it's zombies and not vampires. There was a 3 to 4 minute action scene in the last act of the show where all of our characters, and we have a large cast, so I can't even remember, maybe like 6 or 7 of our main actors were fighting a horde of zombies.
Yeah.
We're talking a lot of zombies. And there's a lot of stuff that happens in this scene, you know, key characters die horribly. We had to play off the emotion. We had to, you know, it was chaos in the scene. And the setups, when I got the footage for it, I can't remember exactly how many setups there were, but it went into double letters. So normally, you know, we'll have our setups like, you know, A, B, C, D. When we get to Z, it goes to AA, then AB, then AC. And I can't remember, this might have went to like AS or AT. Wow. I'm sure my assistant editor, Justin Cruz, would remember, because he's the one who had to prep the bins for me. But it was a lot. And the way it was shot, it's not like the whole scene was like shot in every take. They shoot sections of a scene. So like this one beat where the zombies break through the door will be like maybe 1 or 2 setups. And then, this other beat where they're reacting, that might be a couple setups. And we shoot everything, typically 2 cameras, sometimes 3. I can't remember if those are 2 or 3 cameras. Some of them might have been 3, some of them might have been 2. So there was just a lot to sift through because I had maybe like 2 or 3 bins, I can't remember now, to with everything in it. And in order to not be overwhelmed, what I have my assistant editor do is in Avid, in frame view, you could create a sequence and then just put like a big subcap with text. And so I'd have him put like notes and then like what certain coverage was and then the coverage. So they didn't sort it in like alphabetical order. It was in story order of what each beat was. So now when I look at it, it's like, okay, I need all the stuff for a certain beat. Oh, I only need to look at these 3 setups for that beat. And that way I wouldn't be overwhelmed and I wasn't constantly going, where was that again? Because sometimes when you can only look at a single frame, all you see is zombies.
Well, especially when I watched the scene, I was like, this is a lot of zombies.
Yeah, it was a lot of zombies.
Yeah.
And so depending on the frame you pick, you might not be able to tell. And like my memory, I don't have a memory where I remember everything. I will forget. So I need those little notes to be like, okay, that's where that is. Great. So I'm not completely overwhelmed going, oh my God, how am I going to get this? Oh my God. Which I kind of reacted to that when all the footage started coming in. I was like, Andrew, I'm going to kill you. Andrew is a director. And I was like, Andrew, what did you do? He was like, sorry, have fun. It's going to look great, right? I'm like, yes, it'll look great after I kill you. You don't usually speak to your directors like that, but I've worked with Andrew and he was one of the editors on the show. So I was just like, dude, what is this? But, he did what was necessary for the scene and it turned out great. But it was just, it can be a little daunting sometimes when you're handed that and you're like, oh God, okay, I have to get this cut in the next day and a half. See what I can do.
We'll post the YouTube link so people can see the scene in the comments because you sent that to me earlier. I do have an interesting question from Shauna. And I'd like to hear this because I know how hard you've worked to get where you are. And that is, how are you able to shift from assistant to editor?
Okay, so see if I could tell the short version of this story. If there's a short version. So assistant to editor, it's happened twice. So the first time around, which was roughly 13, 14 years ago, I was working on a lot of, I was working non-union on a lot of mostly documentary stuff, a lot of clip shows. For the first 10 years of my career, like 90% of my work was working for E! Entertainment and their affiliated networks like G4 TV or Style Network. I did a show on BBC, but it was like through Comcast and NBC Universal and then just aired on BBC. But the first time I was always really driven, working really hard as an assistant. I was an assistant for about 1.5 years. But about the year mark, they started trusting me with more like editor type work, stuff that it wasn't creative storytelling, but stuff that would normally fall on the editors. And they would slowly start just giving me more and more responsibility as they saw, they're like, okay, yeah, she can do it. And then it was really my post supervisor at the time, James Voda, who, he believed in me. He loved my ambition. He loved that I was passionate about my work. And, I always just worked hard and I always let him know, like, I've never been quiet either time about my desire to edit. So I made people aware. I was like, this is what I want. This is what I want. I will work hard for it. And he was, he had to convince producers to hire me. But it eventually happened at about the 1.5 year mark working for him. And then he hired me pretty much regularly for the next 10 years. I was one of the most requested editors. And that was just all through hard work because I had to prove myself. And then about 10 years in, it was a process that started a couple years earlier. I kind of hit a ceiling where it's like, you know what? now at this point in my career, everything I'm editing, it's just more feels like I'm collecting a paycheck. Like I'm not as passionate about it as I was. And I worked on a game show, I worked on interview shows, I worked on short form packages, I was on site at Comic-Con for G4, which was really fun because I'm a huge nerd. I've been on site for the Grammys and the Academy Awards when I did the red carpet coverage packages and show opens, did lots of documentaries. But there was nothing that was really like getting me excited anymore, challenging me in a way. And so it's like, man, I got to try to figure out how to, make my way into scripted and see if this is something that I really want to do. Because even as a scripted editor, I make less money than I did editing the non-union stuff. And actually have to work a lot harder too. So it's something that started years before. I met an editor at Edit Fest in LA, like 2 years before I got my first opportunity. And we just chatted, we met, we kept in touch on Facebook for a couple years. And, this whole time I'm like giving presentations on my work, on my visual effects work, on the show opens, and just putting myself out there on social media. And the whole time, he's watching me do this as years go by. And he was like, hey, I'm working on this new big show, and it was Minority Report for Fox. And I need someone like great, because this is a great big opportunity. And I need someone who could handle like all the visual effects and stuff. And I know a lot of people because I've been putting myself out there. Is there anyone you could recommend? And I thought about it for like an hour. And then I recommended myself. And I told him, I was like, hey, look, my background. There's nothing for me to hide about who I am, because I know sometimes the advice people give is like, oh, just lie, fake it till you make it. And I'm not that person. I'm a terrible liar. I just feel like that kind of messes up my credibility. If like someone finds out, it's like, no, I'm just going to work hard. This is who I am. And there was no hiding who I was and where my experience lied. I was like, look, what do I have to do to convince you to not hire me? But I was like, but to consider me for an interview at least. Because the worst thing, he'd be like, no, and I'd be in the same spot I was already in. Best case scenario, he just gives me the shot for the interview. And he was like, okay, first thing that, because I basically showed him I was willing to do whatever it takes, and I was going to do a good job, and I really wanted it. And he's like, I know you don't know the specific workflows. He's like, but you have all the skills. Like he even said when he looked at my resume, he's like, your resume says you're not ready just because of the type of credits I had. There were no scripted credits. He was like, but I know you're ready. With everything you've done, you have all the skills. And so he hired me. And that was something that like, it took 2 years of us just like keeping in touch before he even like thought of reaching out to me. He didn't even initially reach out to me to consider me. I'm the one who put myself forward, and he was like, hey, will you consider me? Please. I really, really want this. And so like, I will always be grateful for that, because that's kind of the catch-22 everyone who's trying to break into scripted has to go through. It's like, okay, you don't have the experience yet, but you can't get the experience so you get the job, but no one wants to hire someone for the job if you don't have the experience. It's like, this makes no sense. It's like you have to, so it's, he saw my potential, he saw my passion. And on that show, I ended up being like the lead assistant editor on it, just because, I had all the skills. It was just about learning some of the workflow details of working on a scripted television show and, learning some paperwork. I had never seen a continuity before I worked on the show. And so I had to be like, okay, what is this? And it's really easy. A continuity is just like a short description of every scene in the order they appear in the show and like their length, because people will refer to that when they're trying to reshuffle scenes, see if they can improve the story or see where they need to cut time. And so I just had to, I had to fight for myself. And so that happened roughly 4 to 5 years ago. And then I had to start about 2 years in, because I had to figure out how to do the assistant editor job really well. Because even though I had the skills, I still had to know how to implement them. That's a whole nother thing. And that comes with experience. About 2 years in, I'd always ask if I could cut a scene or two. And then I really started pushing for it. And it took a couple years of me pushing for it to even with, discussions with my editors. You don't go above your editor's head. And because they need to be your champion. And before I was able to get my first scripted television credit on Colony. And it was the end of the 3rd season, which is the 2nd season I had worked on. Before I was able to get that. And even Legends, I've worked on Legends for 2 seasons. The 1st season, I worked as an assistant editor. And then the 2nd season, like at the end of the 1st season, I was already having discussions with the editor. I was like, dude, please come on. And he was like, yeah, let's do this. Let's edit one together. And so it's like, we were able to approach the post producer like together. And he's like, yeah, let's make this happen. That's the other tricky thing is you have to have producers who are willing to give you a chance. There are shows where producers, they don't care how good you are. They will only ever see you as an assistant and they don't care otherwise. And they will not give you a chance. And then there are other shows where the producers are like, yeah, you can do it. And, they'll check with the editor like, hey, she ready? And the editor hopefully will back you up and be like, oh yeah, she's more than ready. They're like, all right, let's do this. And that's essentially what happened on Legends. We're like, yeah, she's good. You think she could do it? And he's like, oh yeah. And they're like, yeah, let's do this. And of course, like I said, they dumped me on the deep end. First act, I had a huge tea house action fight scene that I had to cut together. They were really happy with. And then this last episode was just a monster with the zombie horde. There was so much going on. Watching the Legends is great to work on because we have a huge fan base and they know how to use social media. So you see how people are reacting to the show. You're just like, oh my God. We'll all go on Twitter and we'll be like, ooh, this person said this. Well, this person said this because we're all nerds. And we want to see what people think of the show. And people, they're like, oh my God, I can't believe you guys. That was like the best episode of the season so far. You made me cry. And that is like the biggest compliment when someone's like, oh my God, I cried so hard. And you know that you were the one to put that together in a way that was able to evoke that kind of strong emotion out of a person. And it was like, oh my God, this is the best. I love this. It's such a great feeling. Like some of my other shows, they didn't have such a rabid Twitter following, but there are specific hashtags for the show. So it's, people shoot fan reactions on YouTube. So it's like nice to see that feedback when your show airs.
Well, Claire says this is very inspiring.
Oh, yay. The truth of everything is like, I work my ass off and I would not be where I am if other people weren't willing to help me. It's like they want to see me succeed. And so, that's how I get work. It's recommendations through other people, things other people hear about, and they'll, recommend me for jobs.
Now, Haley has an interesting follow-up for this. She wants to know if the producers aren't willing to let you try and expand your credits or learning, should you try to find a new show to work on? And how do you go about trying to move up in your career in that current job position?
Typically, and this isn't always the case, sometimes people will get a shot the first season they're on a show. You just never know. But typically, it's like you're with the show for a season, so you could establish that relationships, establish that trust. And the most important thing is you have to have an editor who will back you up, because that editor can keep you held down, because they will ask the editor what they think of you. And if the editor won't support you, then you're not going to get an opportunity, because they'll just be like, nope. The showrunners, the executive producers, they're the ones who hire the editors. So they trust the editors. There are editors out there who intentionally try to keep people down because, they might see them as competition or who knows what. But so you need to move on. If the producers aren't going to give you a shot, then why would they give you a shot a season from now? Maybe they'll give you a shot 5 seasons from now. Not a lot of shows go that long. Most shows get canceled. So you have to find, you have to just move on and try to find a show. That's the thing. You never know where you might have your opportunity. You just don't. I work for a company, Greg Berlanti's company, who has like, I don't even know, 17, 18, 20 shows on air. He has a lot of shows on air. He does all of the superhero shows on CW. He does Sabrina. God, what is the new Sabrina called?
Isn't it just Sabrina on Netflix you're talking about?
No, it has a longer name.
Okay.
But he does You. He does Doom Patrol. He does Titans. So he does a lot of the DC Universe shows. So he has a lot of shows. And Blind Spot is another Greg Berlanti show. I like the superhero shows because I like watching that stuff. But, within that company, they are very well known for promoting assistants. Like they want to see that. They're like, oh, if they find someone that is good, they're like, oh yeah, let's give them an opportunity. And, it's nice to have that because that's not always the case when you're working at companies. They just want to keep you where you are. But this company, they're very, very well known for that in town. And so I feel very lucky and fortunate, well, not lucky, but fortunate that, I'm able to work for them so I could keep moving forward with my career on shows that I really enjoy editing. So it's, and, it might suck. It's like, man, I invested like a year into this show and these producers, and then realizing you need to move on somewhere else too. And you might have to start over a little bit as far as like trying to move up. That's just what you have to do. I mean, I had to do it. And I just kept moving on, kept trying to do good work.
Haley did mention that it's The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina.
There we go.
And
I knew it wasn't Sabrina the Teenage Witch.
Now, someone actually had an interesting question here that sort of expands on what you've been talking about, which is Justin wants to know, what's the process of joining the union after being hired for Minority Report, since you'd previously been working on non-union projects?
Well, in order to join the union, you have to have a certain amount of hours it's in LA, it's tricky. It's different in New York. I know that. In LA, you have to go through contract services and you have to have a minimum amount of approved working hours. It varies for assistant editor and editor. And then once you get on the roster through contract services and take your safety test, then you go to the union, you tell them, hey, I'm on the roster now. And then you pay your dues and join the union, but you can't join the union unless you're on the roster. It's a little bit complicated. It wasn't too complicated for me because I had 10 years of editing experience already accumulated. I was working regularly. I just never bothered joining because, the fees are expensive. So I was like, well, what's the point of joining? I'm not getting union work yet. So once I got that opportunity, I like fast tracked it. I was like, oh crap. Okay. Need to get my hours together. And because my hours were for the same company, went pretty quickly. But if you're working for a lot of different companies, you have to go through all the HR departments for all the various companies to prove your hours. Luckily, they only had to go to one company, and it was kind of corporate because it was Comcast, and we actually had an HR department. Like we had a whole section of the building that was just HR. So it was really easy just to get the letter from them, give it to contract services. Contract services just had to make one phone call to confirm it because that's the whole purpose of that department in the building. So it's not always that easy for people. So that's why now I encourage people. I was like, can you get on the roster? You don't have to necessarily join the union right away. The roster, you don't have to pay for. You just have to submit your hours. But once you join the union, you have to pay the union fees, and they can be quite pricey. Just the initiation fee. It's kind of a lot of money. So I always tell people, it's like, go get on the roster first. And on your resume, you could say union eligible, because it's literally a phone call to the union and an orientation meeting. and you're in the union. And it's a lot more complicated to actually get on the roster. So it's best to go to the websites to figure all this out, because I'm sure I didn't explain it very well because it is a complicated process. But it's 2 different websites you have to go to.
So this question's coming to you all the way from India. And they're wondering what area, or as a student, what are the aspects an aspiring editor should focus on?
Aspects
Like as a film editor, I guess basically what they're wanting to know is what should they focus teaching themselves and learning?
Well, first off, don't be an NLE snob. Depending on where you work, hold on one second. My nose is running. In Hollywood, we work mainly on Avid as far as broadcast shows. If you work in independent film, a lot of that is Premiere. I've heard Final Cut Pro 10 is used a lot in like local news stations. Mm-hmm. So look at the market you want to work in and see what people are hiring for editors to work on, and make that your priority to learn. I recommend learning all 3 because those are the 3 main NLEs. Not very many people are using Resolve yet to edit. I know they're trying to push that, but if you have time to learn it, sure, but I would put that lower on the priority list. As far as an editing tool, people like using it for dailies and finishing, and that's fine. But also you need to learn how to read people. Go people watching. I learned how to read because I didn't go to film school. So everything I've learned about editing, I've learned from work and life. So I used to work at a haunted house as a scare actor when I was younger, in another lifetime. And that's how I learned how to read people, because you had to learn how to time your scares when you were going to jump out at them by reading their body language. So learn how to read people watching without being creepy. Watch movies, watch good movies and watch bad movies, because you will learn a lot more from watching a bad movie and trying to understand why didn't that work. And it's a great teaching tool. You have to edit. You got to try to put things together, to find footage to work with. You need to have an understanding of how sound design affects story in an edit. I think that's something I'm told by professors that's something a lot of students forget as the teachers are trying to tell them, the other half of your story is your sound. And if your sound is distracting from your edit, the scene won't work, because the people watching, they're being distracted by other things. If there's hits in the dialogue's not cut right. If the sound sounds empty and you should be hearing something, it should never, even if the choice is, this is a silent scene, it's going to be a very quiet scene, it should never feel like the sound is empty unless you are trying to make a point with that. So really focus on how does sound affect you? And it's easy to practice sound because you could pull any clip from anything, strip out the audio, and try to rebuild that sound to sell the scene. That's a big job of assistant editors, is doing temp sound design before it's handed over to the sound department. So sound is very, very important. And just also when you're reading a scene, try to cut for the emotion. What is the point of the scene other than this specific dialogue that's spitting out information? You'll notice a lot of procedurals sometimes, like they're literally telling you everything you need to know, and it's less about what they're feeling and more about the information you're hearing. And then watch a show from another network and it's about what they're not saying. And those are usually the shows that that end up getting, all the awards. It's like the shows that are really good with conveying subtext. And that's a huge tool of the editor. What is the subtext of a scene? Even if it is a scene that's about regurgitating information, it's like, okay, well, how are they feeling as they're saying this information? Like, are we supposed to feel anxiety about this? Are we supposed to be happy about this? Are we supposed to feel tense? So really look at the motion, and it's the trick an editor pulls off is, getting into people's subconscious, just like the scene I cut. It's like people are like, oh my God, you made me cry. Like, I made them cry. That's like a subconscious thing. That's not something they can control. So it's like being able to pull those emotions out of people, that comes from the subtext of the scene and the emotion. And it's very hard. It's very subtle. And if you give two different editors the same scene, they're going to cut it differently. And, it's not, either one would not necessarily be wrong. It's just about, okay, what is the goal of the scene? What's the vision? And it's usually the vision of, if it's TV, it's the producers, or if it's movies, it's the director. What's the vision of this scene? What direction do you want me to take? I mean, I've recut my scenes where they're like, oh no, actually I kind of wanted the scene to play more this way. And it's like, oh, okay. And, I make some tweaks, changes to fit the vision of the person who is basically in charge, who has final cut. It's a friend of mine and mentor, Alan Bell, always says, he's like, we are in a service industry. Editors are there to serve the vision of others. Editors don't have the final cut. We are there to help support the vision of whoever does have final cut. And that's something always to remember as well. Just, keeping your ego in check, making positive contributions, being open-minded and willing to try out. Because one thing, as an editor, is you're dealing with clients, directors, producers, and they have a lot on the line. So you're also dealing with people who might be a little sensitive, might, their egos are under a lot of pressure, have to work with fragile egos. And, it is a lot of pressure to have that kind of power, because especially if you're working on a project that costs millions of dollars, it's on them to make sure they deliver a good product. And it's always good to remember that if they seem a little tense, it's like, no, don't be combative with your clients. Essentially, it's like, be supportive. How can you be supportive to them? Just like the assistant editor is there to support the editor is there to support the director or producer, and, help them get their job done.
Now, to expand on that, because this is interesting, there was a question earlier that I just haven't had a chance to ask, and that is from Jacobo. How do you respond to creative notes from the director, producer, or showrunner that you might not agree with?
Well, I always try them. Because, hey, you never know when it's better, and or it's better for the purpose they're serving. Now, if there's something I feel like is not serving the purpose, I'll try it. Definitely try it. And then I'll be like, I don't know. I kind of put in the form of questions to the director. I'd be like, it's kind of making me feel like it's going this direction. Is that kind of what you want for the scene? Is that how you want it to work? I cut it like this because I was thinking maybe this direction. It's always a suggestion, because like I said, I don't have final cut. But I pick my battles. I'm not going to do that with every single note I disagree with, unless I feel like it's actually hurting the story.
Mm-hmm.
And if I present it to them, I'll be very delicate in how I, try to defend like an alternative way to cutting it. Or maybe I'll find like, we could try to discuss it like, well, this isn't exactly working, but like, what's the note behind the note? Why did they make that note? And then maybe we could find a happy medium, or like a new way that's not the way I originally cut it, and it's not their specific suggestion, but it actually addresses the issue they were having, and it is helping the story along. So it's a nice little balancing act.
Evan from Canada wants to know, when you're doing those reworks with the director, how do you like to rework a scene? that isn't working? Do you recut it from scratch, or do you just do tweaks and slightly tweak it?
Well, I mean, hopefully when I'm in my editor's cut, you know, if it's not working at all in my editor's, because the editor's cut is my version of it to try to get it to work. I would hope, you know, that I'm not doing my job very well because I wasn't working the footage to try to get the scene to work. But I mean, it depends. Sometimes it's like, okay, well, what's not really working? What do we like about what we currently have? And we actually analyze a scene and be like, all right, let's look at some other takes. And sometimes if it's like a completely different direction, then they might just give me like a general no, depending on the director. Some are more, you know, hands-on than others. You know, it depends on the scene. But, you know, we look at it, just be like, what's not working? Is there anything working? And then try to build off of that. You know, it's very, editors are problem solvers, and, you know, there's no like one right default answer to any problem we may come up with in an edit. And that's what makes it really challenging, because it's so open-ended, and you have to make a decision. You can't be, as an editor, you can't be wishy-washy, because then that means you can't make a decision. I mean, an EDL is literally called an edit decision list. You have to make a decision. You have to make a choice. You have to bring your point of view. And maybe it's not the best version of it yet, but, you know, if you talk to any editor, they're, you know, they always hate their first version of the cut. You know, it's always a process to try to figure out what is the best version of this cut to tell the story we want to tell. I mean, with all the new versions of the big movies that seem to be coming out with different cuts, with different directors' cuts that they're spending a bunch of money on, it's like those are prime examples where they're like, the director's like, that's a producer's cut. That's not my cut. My cut's way different. It's like, well, they're working with the same footage, but they are able to get, you know, various cuts. And that's, you know, at the top, the high end of the industry, you know, they still have those problems. Mm-hmm. So it never stops.
Now, we need to wrap up here. So I'm wondering because there's a few people we haven't gotten to, and I'm wondering how they can get in touch with you via Twitter or social media, because you are active in various communities.
Yes, you could find me on Twitter at Monica_edits. And, you know, I respond to people there as much as I can. I try to make sure I get to everyone. And on Facebook, you could also private message me. Don't friend me, because that's like my private friends and family is how I use my Facebook feed for. Mm-hmm. But you could always find me, just private message me.